US President-elect Donald Trump has said he can't rule out using force to retake the Panama Canal, an 82-kilometer waterway cutting between the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans. The Panama Canal handles 5% of the world's cargo and 70% of all cargo going to and from the United States, according to the Panama Canal Authority. Trump was asked about military action at a press conference. Take a look.
The Panama Canal was built for our military. I'm not going to commit to that now. It might be that you'll have to do something. Look, the Panama Canal is vital to our country. It's being operated by China. And we gave the Panama Canal to Panama. We didn't give it to China. And they've abused it.
Why is the Panama Canal vital to the US, and what is China's influence? Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm EP539. Joining us today are Yuan I, National Chengchi University Institute of International Relations Adjunct Research Fellow, and Vincent Chao, Taipei City Councilor, Democratic Progressive Party. Very warm welcome to both of you on the show today. In response to Donald Trump's remarks in December, Panamanian President Jose Raúl Mulino said this.
Es un sinsentido. No existe un solo soldado chino en el canal. Por Dios. Y por otro lado, no va a existir, y nosotros mantenemos con China una relación respetuosa, bien manejada en materia de lo que nos interesa a los dos países. Y yo siempre he mencionado que en lo personal a mí me interesa mucho la relación con China por efecto de exportaciones panameñas a un mercado que lo necesita todo.
The Panama Canal is managed by the Panama Canal Authority, an autonomous government agency. However, two of the canal's ports are operated by a conglomerate owned by Chinese-born Hong Kong tycoon Li Ka-shing, while China's Landbridge Group developed the largest port on Panama's Atlantic coast. A Chinese consortium is building the fourth canal bridge. Another Chinese firm is constructing the Amador Port Cruise Terminal, while another is building the Amador Convention Center. Meanwhile, Shanghai Gorgeous is constructing a natural gas-fired electricity generation facility, and Chinese firms are pitching for water management system contracts to help the Panama Canal protect against drought. Professor Yuan, let me come to you first. So Trump says that the Panama Canal is vital to US interests, and he says it's being operated by China. To what extent is he right or wrong?
I think we all recognized the way Donald Trump portrayed the potentiality of the worst scenarios. I think following that worst scenario thinking, I think that one could easily identify the potential domain of the problems, including geopolitical influence under the Belt and Road initiative, and also it may pose national security risk to the United States, including surveillance, espionage, and disruption of the normal condition, economic dependence of this area's country like on China, and also control over critical infrastructure, I think worries the U.S. mostly, and also finally the control over critical infrastructure plus the potentials for escalation tension. So all in all, what he portrayed will be the worst scenario case. Should it happen, I think Donald Trump will lay out before he inaugurated to attract attention, world attention on this potentiality.
Right. So Vincent, how do you assess, the amount of influence in Panama Canal by China?
Well, I mean, to be fair, I think from Trump's perspective, this may be less to do with territorial expansionism and more to do with his view of correcting past historical grievances. And the Republican right in the United States has for a long time actually been quite upset at the deal that was signed between Jimmy Carter and the Panamanian government in 1979, handing back control over the Panama Canal over a 20-year period, which was completed in 1999.
So we're going to move on to all of that a little bit later, next actually, Vincent. But I wanted to try to get more into, the control of the two ports. So describe to me or assess for me why that's very significant for Trump. Are we talking about, in terms of commercial interests, in terms of the security interests that the professor mentioned, you know, peacetime, wartime?
In terms of geography, I mean, it's absolutely true that the Panama Canal is smack in the middle of an area that the United States would deem as part of its core set of strategic interests. And in addition to commercial traffic, I mean, so much of it is, you know, relying on American security. So much of it's connected to the American Navy, connected to American security. And so allowing, in his view, these ports and and the Panama Canal in general to fall under control of China, I think poses grave national security risks for the United States. But aside from that, on purely the security dynamic, I mean, imagine this. So we've known for years now that China has been focused on this campaign, this One Belt, One Road campaign, to build critical infrastructure around the world, including in places like Sri Lanka, but also others that have direct, not only maritime interests and commercial interests for China, but also naval interests for the Chinese. And we see this, for example, in the Solomon Islands as well. We see this in Southeast Asia, where these ports that are being propped up by Chinese money have, you know, military uses for China. And so I think there's a real fear in the United States right now that after Panama broke relations with us in 2016 and established them with the PRC was going to dominate control over these naval ports in the Panama Canal and use them for military purposes. And as a result, I think that is part of why President Trump is quite insistent that control not fall to the Chinese.
Right. And Professor Yuan, so how can we characterize China's interest in the Panama Canal? Is it directly proportional to the US's vital interest in this canal?
One has to recognize under the rubric of Belt and Road initiative, China in the past decades has accomplished and amazed the world that they could reach out extensively. And now, you know, set alarm for the incoming administration in particular with this immensity and the scope of their capacity building. I think one has to also take into account the big picture. That is, all the global South countries rely heavily on the Chinese input so long as they are in need of to have an infrastructure. So China is able and has demonstrated they are capable of doing it.
Vincent, you mentioned Taiwan. Panama unilaterally severed, you know, ties in 2017.
2017.
Yeah. Container terminal, that's on the Atlantic side, is actually owned by Evergreen of Taiwan. So when you look at these ports, the 5, there are essentially 3 that are operated by the US and Taiwan. SSA Marine, which is part of Carrick's International. And then they basically operate 2 on the Atlantic side, but Balboa is considered to be the main port.
Right.
So in terms of that, in terms of the control over these ports, how much influence, how much power does China have?
So these are ports that are operated by, I think it's Hutchinson, based out of Hong Kong. And certainly there's no overt links between Hutchinson and the CCP. But of course, all companies under Hong Kong or Chinese jurisdiction ultimately have to answer in some way or format to the Chinese government, of course, meaning the CCP. So I think it's hard to divorce the fact that this is a Hong Kong-based company that ultimately the Chinese government, CCP, has in one way or another influence over. And I think the big fear is this. So you talked about Evergreen operating a port. I've been to that port. The United States certainly has extensive, I think, facilities in Panama and across the region as well. And I think there's real fear, which is highlighted just recently in U.S. congressional testimony. What would happen, for example, if a contingency crisis arose in the Taiwan Strait and U.S. naval supplies, U.S. Navy vessels had to traverse the Panama Canal in order to support operations in the Pacific theater? What would China do about it? What would this company, how would this company see it, engaged over this matter? And I think the key part is this, is that nobody can guarantee that these supplies, that these capabilities, that these frigates or other naval vessels would have free passage through these ports and potentially through the Panama Canal if this crisis arose. So I think when they talk about national security implications, they're really looking at sort of not necessarily what happened during peacetime, what happened now, or what happened in terms of commercial shipping, but this more broad what would happen in a contingency scenario where really push came to shove, and both the U.S. and China would have to exert any sort of influence they had over operations over the Panama Canal.
More than a century ago, the United States acquired the rights to buy the land for, build and operate the Panama Canal. It was built from 1904 to 1913 and opened in 1917. Anti-US riots in Panama in 1964 triggered the renegotiation of agreements in 1967. Eventually, in 1977, leaders of both countries signed two new treaties, the Permanent Neutrality Treaty and the Panama Canal Treaty, collectively known as the Torrijos-Carter Treaties, after former US President, the late Jimmy Carter, and then Panama leader General Omar Torrijos. Finally, on December 31st, 1999, the US transferred control of the canal to Panama. Professor Yuan, let me come to you. Can you explain to us how these two treaties worked? They were worked out, by President Carter, and what did he want to achieve with them?
The treaty was negotiated and signed and agreed upon during the time the United States faced daunting challenges strategically, that during which time that the U.S. was about to recognize the PRC. On the one hand, also, he faced a military strategic challenge from the USSR. So that was the time the U.S. under Jimmy Carter wishes to, select an alternative path to secure the regional peace through negotiation instead of the military dominance. So that was the background for such a agreement be negotiated. So there are aspects including to transfer of control of the canal and the restoration of sovereignty. Those are the ABC for ordinary states, but that was the first time ever that the hegemon dealt with the junior partner in such a way, nice way, a diplomatic achievement of the Jimmy Carter. However, Donald Trump criticized heavily about this, about Jimmy Carter's diplomatic legacy recently.
Yeah, I mean, Vincent, do you think that Carter, if he was living today, president today, would he do the same thing? I mean, obviously, things have changed since then.
I think it was actually, if you look at sort of the events that were taking place in the late 70s, well, in the lead up as well, I think a part of it was based out of necessity. Like, they looked at the Panama Canal, and I mean, the Panama Canal is long. I mean, it's 80 kilometers long, the total length of it. I mean, a lot of it's just undefensible. And you already had the protests that were taking place across Panama at the time. You had students charging into U.S. fortifications. You had U.S. soldiers die. You had scores of students die. And I think there was this understanding at the time, or at least this feeling at the time, that if something was not done about this sovereignty, that you would see these prolonged clashes and you would see U.S. administration over the Panama Canal become tenuous at best and chaotic at worst. And I think it's hard to make a decision now in 2025 and looking back at this situation in the 1970s and try to say whether Jimmy Carter made the right or wrong decision.
And in terms of, obviously, you talked about a Taiwan contingency, the great power play. At the moment, Carter didn't have those threats.
Of course.
Nothing so great as what China is. Professor Yuan, so you talked about the Neutrality Treaty, which was that US shipping would be guaranteed and that US would be permitted to use armed force to keep it open. Can you tell me what you think was behind Trump's comments about Chinese soldiers being stationed there? And also whether there's a connection to his first soundbite that we played, which said that the canal was built for the US military.
Sentimentally speaking, I think on average.
Is it only sentimental, though?
No, this is,
right.
On the other hand, strategically, if one were to take into account the practice, the military practice of the PLA of recent years, they developed somehow a very, very interesting and cunning, if not critical, gray zone practice. In the case of the worst scenario, as I said at the very outset, recent episodes suggest something happened in Suez Canal, the derail of disruption. It would create it for the normal passage. So I think as I said, it's highly plausible, okay, in case of emergency, and because it's a very narrow canal, it's now open ocean. So to guarantee the free passage of the normal route requires 100% control of all the scenario, which is very unlikely as we speak. That is why I think the Donald Trump's assumptions are legitimate, but you require further negotiation with the respective authority.
So Vincent, would there be any basis? We all know that Trump has threatened to take back control. Given everything that we know, neutrality treaty, would there be a basis for the US to reassert control?
I think, to be honest, it'll be very hard. But I think we have to look at Trump's comments in the context of this, which is that we've seen sort of these comments that people have labeled kind of really out there and really, really forward-leaning, and perhaps too kind of whimsical in the past. And I mean, certainly he's been in government for 4 years. We've seen, his comments on different issues that people have put one or another label on. But I think what normally happens, if we look at kind of this in hindsight, is that he says something, yes, that is quite far-fetched. That is quite, I think, out there. But you ultimately create the conditions for a negotiation of something that is feasible and doable. And people all of a sudden see, because it's all relative to earlier comments, now this new proposal suddenly becomes much more serious and much more, I think, realistic. And as a result, I do think that we can perhaps imagine that this is setting the stage, these comments about taking control, whether military, economic coercion, taking control over the Panama Canal, as setting the stage of a renegotiation of either treaty or agreement or even something commercial between the United States and Panama that would, number one, perhaps reduce commercial shipping rates for U.S. companies, which would be, I think, directly passed on to consumers in one sense, and perhaps economically speaking, a win for Trump. But also, number two, guaranteeing passage of perhaps naval vessels and perhaps even being able to push back against Chinese operations, China's control over ports in the vicinity. So I think what all of this really is setting this stage for a set of negotiations that will probably take place after Trump takes office.
Right, and it also appears to be a warning to the Chinese, given that part of the neutrality treaty, which is that the US will be permitted to use armed force to keep it open, as you mentioned. Now, let's go back to that press conference at the top of the show. Trump's remarks extend beyond the Panama Canal to Greenland. Take a look.
Well, we need Greenland for national security purposes. I've been told that for a long time, long before I even ran. I mean, people have been talking about it for a long time. You have approximately 45,000 people there. People really don't even know if Denmark has any legal right to it. But if they do, they should give it up because we need it for national security. That's for the free world. I'm talking about protecting the free world. You look at, you don't even need binoculars. You look outside, you have China ships all over the place. You have Russian ships all over the place.
Professor Yuan, so Trump says the US needs Greenland for national security reasons. He said Chinese and Russian ships are everywhere. What makes Greenland so crucial?
This is the first time that new president of the United States will face a very, very tough strategic challenge. The first time that the U.S. has faced two nuclear power adversaries, all right? Taking into account that new phase of a strategic reality, Greenland position itself in such a strategic position.
And Vincent, talking about the geography, Greenland is obviously in the Arctic Circle. What is it that makes it crucial for the US in terms of what the professor said, in terms of the threat from China and Russia?
Well, I think three components, right? I mean, the professor talked about national security, and certainly that's a huge part of it. I mean, Greenland is situated right in sort of the middle of the Atlantic. It's situated close to the Arctic Circle, and certainly China has a lot of interest in what's happening in the Arctic Circle. It's declared itself a near Arctic power and so forth. But the second part of it, which is probably less discussed, is the resources. I mean, they're just tremendous mineral resources, gas, energy, and a lot of that's just undeveloped. China has really put a lot of money in building icebreakers, building this Arctic Belt and Road project to try to build new Arctic bases in its vicinity and so forth. And I think...
And why does it do that? Just for the resources, or is there a little bit more to it?
I think it's a little bit more to it, and it has more to do with the strategic component than less people realize. And I think the focus that China has had is that because very few countries have focused on Arctic in the past, it's very sparsely populated. Everybody's distracted by contingency elsewhere. And China has found that the Arctic, because of global warming, because of these other issues now at play, it's become so much more important than it has in the past, and it's ripe for the taking. And so I do think that taken together, what we can probably deduce from Trump's comments on Greenland are similar to Panama in the respect that I think he's setting the stage for a set of negotiations that would, perhaps in his aim to take care of American security, national security, as well as energy interests, and to find some sort of accommodation with Greenland that may or may not include sovereignty. I mean, a good friend of mine, Alex Gray, who used to serve as chief of staff for Trump in the National Security Council, has floated this idea of a COFA-style agreement, this Compact of Free Association States, similar to what the U.S. has in the Pacific, in which there's an economic agreement, but the U.S., these are sovereign countries, but the U.S. supports these countries in return for certain, I think, extraterritorial rights. And so
basing, that military basing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, and so forth. And so I do think that there is an interest in pursuing these negotiations, which will probably take place after Trump takes office, and it remains to be seen how the Greenlanders or Denmark is going to respond.
Yeah, and interesting that idea of the COFA concept, essentially to be able to have those bases, to have military access to that. How is that, all of that connected to Trump's comments about Canada? You know, and he's talked about Canada being the US's 51st state.
I think the probably, you know, well, the geographic adjacency between the United States and Canada, I think no one has so rude to insult a foreign leader in such a way. You know, I could only say that this is a reflection of the Donald Trump's the mindsets. However, I think geographic, strategically thinking, you know, he emphasized also on the energy and natural resources for the United States and Canada to exploit together.
Right, and Vincent, you know, why not? Why does he want to, you know, take over Canada? Why not have Canada as an ally? Maybe even Canada as a buffer in the Arctic Circle. If there were, say, you know, the melting of the ice caps, making it more viable for military access from Russia to the US.
As a former Canadian, now obviously I have no right to speak on behalf of Canadians anywhere as a former, but I will say this. I mean, if you look at present realities, I don't think Canada is much of either a military ally or a buffer, given how less they spend on military spending. It's very, very low. The capabilities are very, very limited. But with that being said, obviously Canada's a sovereign country, and they're going to make their own decision. There's a 0% chance that this is happening. But I do think if you look at Trump's first term, after he was elected in 2016, took office in 2017, USMCA was actually one of his first priorities. People thought it was going to be China. It was actually Canada and Mexico. And there's a very real willingness, I think, on behalf of President Trump to really find ways of renegotiating the trade treaties and finding ways to reduce the trade deficit the U.S. has. And he's floating these ideas as a way to force Canadians to come to the negotiation table.
Okay, so moving back to the Panama Canal, in October 2024, the Panama Canal Authority announced a new annual revenue record of nearly $5 billion. It says the maximum sustainable capacity of the canal is between 36 and 38 ships a day, but a prolonged bout of dry weather in 2023 has reduced those numbers. Panama Canal is situated 26 meters above sea level and needs fresh water to operate the series of locks that lift ships to enter and leave it. Each transit uses on average 200 million litres of water, though many of the reservations for passage are booked in advance at a fixed price. A small number are held back and sold to the highest bidder. On November 8th, for example, Japan's NES Group paid nearly $4 million on top of usual transit fees of around $400,000 to expedite passage for a liquefied petroleum gas carrier, and that was a record fee. But the record revenue, how can there be this news coming out when Panama Canal says that the reason why it needs to increase the toll rates is because the number of vessels has gone down?
Well, so, I mean, I think every country in the world believes that the Panama Canal is charging too much. It's just, that agreement is not limited to the United States. But I do think that Panama is under a bit of pressure as well because they funded basically this huge expansion of the canal that they now have to repay. But I do think that as countries think about the Panama Canal, they have a monopoly on essentially all shipping that needs to go through this canal, which is essentially all ships that need to go from Atlantic to the Pacific. And so I think the fear is not through the everyday commercial shipping. The fear is that when push comes to shove, when all of a sudden a naval mission needs to pass, when all of a sudden these contingencies arise, who's going to get priority? Who's going to get rights? And I think that's the big problem that we face today, and that's probably at the heart of Trump's grievances towards the Panama Canal.
Professor Yuan I and Vincent Chao, thank you for joining Taiwan Talks today. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Thank you for watching the show today. Stay safe and see you next time.
In the face of adversity, the power of truth.
A roadmap for a just and open world, charted by the freest country in Asia.
Taipei for Taiwan Plus.
Taiwan Plus News, a voice of freedom in Asia.